Hello and welcome to the second of two podcasts for March 2023 from Le Monde Diplomatique. My name's George Miller, and my guest in this episode is Jamie Maxwell, a journalist who's based in Glasgow. Before we begin, just a quick reminder that all previous episodes of this podcast are on the website at mondediplo.com, and you can subscribe to it wherever you get your podcasts, so that you never miss another episode. In the first of this month's paired podcasts, we looked at the surprise resignation of New Zealand's Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern. In this one, we're talking about Scotland's First Minister Nicola Sturgeon and what her surprise departure means for the prospects of Scottish independence and the future of the party she successfully led to election victory after assuming the leadership in 2014. In terms reminiscent of Ardern's resignation speech, Sturgeon spoke of the brutality of modern politics and the toll that takes on the individual. The job of First Minister, she said, demands giving absolutely everything of yourself, continuing, that can only be done by anyone for so long. For me, it is now in danger of becoming too long. So as the dust begins to settle, has Sturgeon's abrupt resignation set the cause of Scottish independence back by revealing divisions in the party that Humza Yousaf, the new leader announced this week after a bruising contest, will struggle to heal? I spoke to Jamie before the result of the leadership contest was announced, though Yousaf, as continuity candidate if not Sturgeon's anointed successor, was already widely expected to win. I began by remarking that it was quite some time since the SNP had put itself through a leadership contest.
The last leadership contest the SNP had was in 2004, and it was to replace John Swinney, who was SNP leader between 2000 and 2004. He is currently Nicola Sturgeon's Deputy First Minister. He is also outgoing, so he's decided to leave alongside Sturgeon. Alex Salmond won that contest in 2004. In fact, it was the birth of the sort of Salmond-Sturgeon duopoly in nationalist politics. When Nicola Sturgeon became SNP leader in 2014, her candidacy was uncontested. She was very much Salmond's anointed heir, and it wouldn't have made any sense for anyone to stand against her anyway, because she was enormously popular within the party and among the party grassroots. So, in 2014, when Sturgeon became leader, there was no election.
So this leadership contest is the first opportunity the party has really had in the best part of 20 years to air the kind of differences of opinion, debates about direction, personalities that there has been in as I say, in 20 years if Salmond gave way to Sturgeon without any opposition.
This is the first opportunity the party has had to choose its own strategic trajectory and direction, I think, for 2 decades. I think it would be fair to say that for the duration of Salmond's leadership and the majority of Sturgeon's, there wasn't a huge amount of discontent within the party about where Scottish nationalism was going, because it was going forward. It was moving forward at a serious clip, at a decent pace. It was making progress electorally, and support for independence was rising. Neither of those two things seem to be happening anymore. Support for the SNP has not collapsed by any means since Sturgeon's resignation. But even prior to that, it was beginning to stall. And support for Scottish independence fluctuates between sort of 40 and 50% now, from one poll to the next. So nationalist activists are starting to ask, how do we keep this momentum going? Or how do we rediscover it, rather? And has the strategy, both for winning elections at Holyrood and dragging Scotland towards the secessionist finishing line, has the strategy we've been pursuing for the last 40 years just run its course? The debate is increasingly, I think, existential within the party.
And with a whole new generation of candidates, and we'll come to that. But I wanted to go back. I mean, it seems like a long time now, but it's only a month. It's barely a month since Sturgeon resigned. You say in your piece there had been rumours for some time that the end was approaching. Nonetheless, it still came as a bit of a surprise, the timing of it. Is that
the timing of Sturgeon's resignation was a surprise, but not the fact of it. I mean, I think there was a consensus among Scottish political journalists really for the past couple of years that Sturgeon was thinking about a life and a career beyond Bute House, beyond the Scottish political front lines, and she was trying to map out an exit route. But the feeling was that she would stick around until the next UK general election, which will take place in 2024, and then sort of inaugurate this next generation of nationalist leaders. To that extent, her announcement came as a genuine shock to the Scottish body politic, as it were, and even the highest echelons of the Scottish government. No one anticipated this. So the decision felt accelerated and it felt hurried. But I think it was prompted by a sort of steady accumulation of crises and setbacks. The most recent of which, and the most significant of which, was the decision at the end of last year by the UK Supreme Court, the ruling rather, that Holyrood, Scotland's devolved national parliament in Edinburgh, did not have the constitutional authority to stage an advisory referendum on Scottish independence. And that ruling sort of marked the end of Sturgeon's strategy for securing independence. That was a strategy rooted in the idea of legitimacy, domestic, political and legal legitimacy, meaning that if Scots voted to leave the UK, Westminster would accept that vote. And international legitimacy, meaning that international institutions, notably the EU, would accept that vote and possibly even facilitate it. So Sturgeon pivoted in the wake of that decision to this idea of a de facto referendum on independence, meaning that a UK general election or a Holyrood election would be framed as a plebiscite on Scottish secession. And that was a characteristic misstep, I think, on Sturgeon's behalf, because elections can't be fought on the basis of binary referendum questions. That's just not how they work. And so even senior members of her own party sort of dismissed this idea and talked it down. And I think that moment, at the end of last year, the UK Supreme Court ruling and Sturgeon's decision to press ahead with this de facto referendum idea, that signalled the beginning of the end of Sturgeon's first ministerial tenure.
It was a sense that the avenues open to her were sort of closing off. There was no longer a path that she could navigate and be confident in taking the party and enough of the nation with her in order to really prevail. She couldn't see that. And I guess, as a human being, she was just feeling exhausted by all that she'd been through at the same time as a background to that.
Yeah, and I mean, her preference for a second referendum was an agreed referendum. The UK government would, as they did in 2012, the run-up to the 2014 referendum, consent on paper to Scotland staging a second referendum and promise to abide by the result. Successive Tory governments just flat out refused to negotiate a second referendum on the same terms as the 2014 referendum, or on any terms at all. So Sturgeon just ran through the different options available to the SNP and ran out of those options. And I think this point about her being personally exhausted is an important one too. It's worth noting that Nicola Sturgeon is a career politician and has been in politics essentially her entire adult life. I mean, she first ran for Parliament, I think in 1992, for a Westminster seat, unsuccessfully. She was part of the first cohort of Scottish parliamentarians in 1999. She was elected at the age of 27 or 28. By 2004, she was de facto leader of the opposition at Holyrood. By 2007, she was Deputy First Minister. By 2014, she was First Minister. This is what she's done her entire life, and the effect has been attritional, I think. And she noted in her resignation speech at Bute House that the years of governing Scotland, of fighting relentless political battles, had taken a huge sort of psychological and emotional toll both on her and on her family. And she has noted repeatedly, she's hinted repeatedly over the course of the last couple of years in interviews with the media that she's still young enough to go on and do other things. And the working assumption is that she will line up a fancy job for herself in Europe, in Brussels or in New York.
And I guess she came to sort of intellectual and political maturity, or consciousness, maybe not maturity, but consciousness, in the Thatcher and Major years. For people who listen to this, who maybe don't know a lot about the sort of history of Scottish politics, what was the kind of political landscape in which she was, being formed like?
So Sturgeon joined the SNP, I think, in 1987. as a 16 or 17-year-old. And she was often asked, particularly in the run-up to her becoming SNP leader at the end of 2014, why she ended up joining the SNP and not the Labour Party. As someone of a sort of broadly centre-left social democratic orientation. And she said, well, first of all, only Scottish independence would have sort of liberated Scotland, as it were, from Tory rule. She was radicalised, politicised by Thatcherism in the 1980s. And secondly, she opposed the British nuclear deterrent. And that's an important part of the SNP's sort of moral identity, is its opposition to British nuclear weapons, which are located, for the most part, in Scotland, in the Scottish West Coast. So those were the two rationalisations, the two major factors in her decision to join the SNP. But in the 1980s and 1990s, and even up until the early 2000s, the Scottish National Party was not seen as... It was a peripheral force. It was not seen as a prospective party of government. Obviously, in the 1990s and 1980s, there was no Scottish Parliament, so there could be no Scottish government. And support for Scottish independence in the 1980s, 1990s, early 2000s was restricted to maybe between 20 and 30% of the electorate. So Sturgeon joined the SNP and has built a career around a commitment to a once quite unpopular cause that has since become mainstream, due in no small part to her political skills and talents. And so the Scottish political landscape has been transformed over the course of the last 4 years, from one in which nationalism was marginal to one in which it was dominant.
Maybe you could contrast for listeners the SNP under Salmond and the SNP under Sturgeon, because it seems to me that it took a considerable leap forward under her leadership, and she represented something more modern, something more European, perhaps something that younger voters could identify, maybe women voters could identify with more than with Alex Salmond's SNP. I mean, is that a fair characterisation of partly what was going on under her leadership?
It's a knotted question. because I mean, I think there's a meaningful debate to be had about the extent to which Sturgeonism was a distinct political trend from Salmondism, or if indeed Sturgeonism and Salmondism are things at all. Sturgeon was appointed unopposed as SNP leader in November 2014 in the aftermath of this first sort of failed, from a nationalist perspective, independence referendum. And she ran unopposed, first of all, because she'd established herself as a very sort of competent and respected health secretary in Salmond's government, and had a reputation for being very lawyerly and judicious in the performance of her ministerial duties. But she was also the breakout star of the independence campaign, or of the Yes campaign, and she was a very effective advocate for independence on the campaign trail and in the media. And she was seen, crucially, I think, as being less combustible and more disciplined, and frankly more likeable than Alex Salmond, who was always a hugely polarising figure, and, as you just alluded to, never popular with women voters in Scotland. He was seen as being the sort of swaggering alpha male, which a lot of people found very off-putting. In addition, I think this is quite an important point. I think there was a sense, or perhaps a hope, that Nicola Sturgeon would give the SNP a more coherent social democratic identity as a leader, whereas Salmond had been very keen on the sort of Irish Celtic Tiger model and on financial deregulation and corporate tax cuts, and had a weird, outdated fixation on all these kind of free market or even Lafferite ideas. Sturgeon, by contrast, pitched independence as the mechanism for protecting in Scotland what remained of Britain's post-war welfare state, and from the sort of privatising and asset stripping instincts of successive UK governments. And that, I think, was the main distinction between the two of them. Sturgeon was going to iron out those neoliberal inconsistencies in Salmond's approach to government. That was the theory, anyway. That was the assumption that a lot of people, including me at the time, a lot of commentators, including me at the time, worked on.
And in terms of their vision of the path to independence, were there differences that you could detect there?
No.
I mean, obviously, with her coming to power after the referendum, that was a path which had been tried once. So inevitably, there had to be some kind of reset and reformulation. But she struck me as kind of more measured in her approach, and and more procedural, perhaps, than Salmond, who again seemed like a bit of a sort of elemental force. But maybe that's a difference of presentation more than a difference of substance.
I think it is a difference of presentation more than one of substance. Salmond was perhaps more improvisational and populist in his approach to running Scotland and running Scotland's devolved institutions. Sturgeon has been very technocratic and centralised. But the core characteristic of Scottish nationalism over the course of the last 40 years, in addition to its broadly centre-left ideological bearing and its enthusiasm for the European Union, has been its constitutional gradualism. Constitutional gradualism, in the context of Scottish nationalism, means gradually, slowly building up a sort of supermajority for independence or for some form of constitutional change. The idea that Scotland will almost incrementally secede from the Union. Its autonomy will be augmented through a series of stages, transfers of power from Westminster, from London to Edinburgh, at the end of which Scotland will find that it is essentially a sovereign country or officially and fully a sovereign country. Sturgeon and Salmond were in complete agreement on that point. So that's why I sort of suggested earlier that it's quite hard to. I think the differences between them are aesthetic and superficial in a lot of important respects. They don't represent two distinct trends of Scottish nationalism.
And in terms of that sort of gradualism, that sort of augmented autonomy, I guess quite an important contributory part of that is convincing perhaps some voters who are on the fence that confidence they might place in a Scottish administration is justified. So if Holyrood seems to be executing their functions competently, successfully, and better than Westminster, then those are things which will build confidence in those who are pro-independence and perhaps win over some people who are sitting on the fence, as I say. And I wondered if we could maybe talk about some challenges that Sturgeon faced in that sort of context and how that sort of played into sort of perceptions of the Scottish government and her leadership. And I guess the most salient one is her handling of COVID, where she had the advantage of being compared to Boris Johnson in London. But seriously, how do you sort of rate the way that she handled those difficult years?
It's occasionally been suggested, certainly during the latter stages of Sturgeon's tenure, that she ran a PR department with the government attached. And I think her management of the COVID crisis somewhat bears that criticism out. As you've suggested, she very much benefited from comparison to the sort of bumbling and chaotic response of Boris Johnson to coronavirus. And Johnson just seemed relentlessly out of his depth for the duration of the pandemic. Sturgeon, on the other hand, communicated with the public very well and never looked panicked. It's also true that the Scottish Government imposed some social distancing measures a bit sooner than the UK Government and lifted them a bit later. That said, Sturgeon also made some of the same mistakes. She failed to set up an early test and trace system, and she, like Johnson, allowed COVID-positive patients to be discharged from hospitals into care homes. And in the end, I think Scotland's overall sort of COVID death rate was not noticeably better than that of the UK as a whole. So what really marked Sturgeon out during those years was her capacity to convey and project a sense of calm and political command. And that gave Scots the perhaps superficial impression that Scotland fared considerably better than the rest of the UK over the course of the crisis. I'm just not sure it did. But it was a testament to Sturgeon's sort of skills of political management and her capacity to win the air war and the PR battle when she needed to.
In terms of longer term policies, she made quite a thing about closing the education gap in attainment. That was kind of like a flagship policy. And her record there wasn't particularly illustrious. And also her tenure hasn't been free of scandals. So although, as you say, she ran a good PR campaign on things like COVID, it's not the case that her record is blemish-free or her policies have all been sort of carried through to fruition, is it?
No, and Sturgeon made a huge show in 2015 of telling the Scottish media that she would close the class attainment gap in Scottish schools And she ostentatiously invited the media to judge her. That would be her legacy, she said. And something she abjectly failed to do. I think she would argue that COVID made that impossible. But the reality is that she leaves office not having achieved that particular aim. Her tenure was far from scandal-free. There was, of course, massive and incredibly bitter falling out with Alex Salmond between 2018, 2019 and 2021. I mean, it's ongoing, but it's now sort of playing in the background of nationalist politics rather than the foreground. And then there were things like this, like the so-called ferries fiasco, which has become sort of emblematic of the problems of incumbency that have increasingly piled up at the SNP's feet in recent years. In that instance, to cut a very long story short, the Scottish Government stands accused of and denies having essentially rigged the contracting process for the construction of a new fleet of ferries that were meant to serve Scotland's island communities. It's a really vital piece of Scottish public infrastructure. The construction process itself was subsequently botched and has run massively over budget and massively off schedule, and the whole thing has collapsed into a sort of quagmire of mutual recrimination, which has left Sturgeon wrestling with these allegations of cronyism and incompetence and sleaze that on any other day and on any other issue she might level at the Tory government down south. But I think the SNP's failure on the ferries has sort of added to this slow but visible erosion of public confidence and support for Sturgeon's administration, and reinforced the broader mood of decay that has attached itself to her government.
And then in the dying days of her leadership, there was the controversy over the Gender Recognition Reform Act and the clash that provoked with Westminster. And I know that's another huge issue, and we don't really have time to get into the detail of it here. But maybe in terms of the sort of fault lines that it identified in Scottish politics, because that sort of seems to play into issues that are coming up in the leadership debate about the kind of vision for Scotland that the three separate candidates have. I mean, was that, in terms of politics, do you think there was misjudgment there in Sturgeon's part in seeking to push that through at the time she did and in the way she did?
I mean, I think if anything, Sturgeon's mistake was in not pressing ahead with the reform of the Gender Recognition Act earlier. I mean, there was a consensus in 2015, with the exception of the Scottish Conservatives, I believe, at Holyrood in favour of reform of the Gender Recognition Act. Sturgeon, sensing a bit of resistance within her own party and a bit of resistance in the Scottish media, decided to punt this issue out into consultation, I think twice over the course of the following years. And that allowed opposition to grow, that gave time and space to the opposition to get organised, and it allowed this controversy to fester. So what Sturgeon wanted to do was reform the Gender Recognition Act, essentially to streamline the process by which a person in Scotland can legally change gender. In her eyes, just bringing Scottish law up to international best practice on this issue. But she dithered and she delayed, and the net result was that her opponents within the independence movement, who have become increasingly restive, I think, over her failure to make progress towards independence, to secure a second referendum, used it as a wedge issue with which to destabilise her leadership, even at the cost of the SNP's unity and electability. And that's what's starting to manifest itself now. I think it's worth pointing out that there is a section of Scottish political life which is terminally online. Twitter has not been healthy for the most primal elements of the Scottish independence campaign. They have allowed their frustration with the SNP's failure to secure independence to sort of curdle into something really quite dangerous and conspiratorial and paranoid. And they have latched onto the idea of woke culture and transgender ideology as their preferred targets. And those are two things they associate very closely with the current Sturgeonite leadership of the SNP. And I think that partly explains the divided and quite sort of toxic nature of a lot of the party's internal politics just now.
Well, that's the perfect introduction, I think, to talk about the future and the three candidates who are fighting it out at the moment to replace Sturgeon. I wondered if you could just give us a little sort of pen portrait of each of them in turn and say, what the sort of ground that they are contesting, that they're currently debating on. What are the sort of key things, and where are they each coming from?
So the three candidates running to replace Sturgeon are Humza Yousaf, who's the current Health Secretary in Sturgeon's government, Kate Forbes, who's the current Finance Secretary, and Ash Regan, who's a former Minister for Community Safety, who resigned over Sturgeon's gender reform plans. Regan is not a credible contender. She's not going to win, but her candidacy does speak to that sort of bubbling below the surface level of discontent with Sturgeon's sort of technocratic, insular leadership style. Yousaf and Forbes, on the other hand, are interesting candidates because I think they represent competing cultural traditions within Scottish nationalism. Yousaf is a Glasgow politician and a self-described social progressive who is hinting at a return to some of the more sort of insurgent and social democratic politics that Sturgeon represented in the early stages of her tenure as First Minister. Forbes, meanwhile, is a rural politician from the Scottish Highlands who is profoundly religious. She belongs to an obscure Scottish evangelical church with about 12,000 members and socially conservative, and has pitched her vision for independence around the twin pillars of economic deregulation and serving the interests of Scottish small business. Her husband may be an active member of the Scottish Conservative Party, which is an interesting and revealing side note in her candidacy. But what makes this contest potentially existential for the SNP, in my view, is that a Forbes victory would disrupt and potentially reverse the political strategy that the party has pursued for the past 40 years. And that strategy has been to try and replace Labour as the dominant party of the Scottish urban working and middle classes and to establish Scottish nationalism as the primary centre-left force in Scottish politics. That strategy has been wildly successful for the SNP. The SNP gradually in the 1990s and early 2000s, and then very quickly in 2014 and 2015, broke into Labour's traditional heartland, as it were, in the Central Belt and converted hundreds of thousands of voters who had historically voted Labour to the nationalist cause. It's that constituency in Scottish political life that sits at the centre of the SNP's electoral success, certainly over the course of the last 10 years, perhaps over the course of the last 15. So to put it bluntly, I would argue that the SNP hegemony runs through industrial and post-industrial Scotland. And in addition, depends really quite heavily on the enthusiasm of really quite socially liberal Scots under the age of 35 living in these big metropolitan centres for independence. The problem with Kate Forbes is that she is a provincial conservative and she adheres to a set of values that simply do not seem to align with those of the core independence base. So the first thing that would happen if Kate Forbes won the SNP leadership contest and then was elected as First Minister by SNP MSPs at Holyrood is that the Greens, the Scottish Greens, the other major pro-independence party at Holyrood, would immediately withdraw from the coalition governing agreement that they struck with Sturgeon after the last Holyrood election in 2021. And they will do that because they have said that they will not work with someone who opposes reform of the Gender Recognition Act, which ties into everything we've discussed thus far. Kate Forbes would not take forward reform of the Gender Recognition Act, and that is a red line for the Scottish Greens. So automatically the majority that pro-independence parties have, the governing majority that pro-independence parties have at Holyrood would fall apart in the event of a Forbes victory. On top of that, Humza Yousaf is very much unambiguously the preferred candidate of the party hierarchy. He's very clearly Sturgeon's preferred successor. So he has the support and the backing of senior SNP politicians like Angus Robertson, the Constitution Secretary, John Swinney, who we've mentioned, very popular figure among the SNP grassroots, Stephen Flynn, who's the party's leader at Westminster. So if Forbes won, you would have this almost Corbyn-esque scenario in which large numbers of SNP parliamentarians didn't support her and she'd constantly have her back to the wall inside her own party. So again, that's why these things are existential for the SNP. Yes. That's why they're really fraught.
And what if Yousaf wins? As you said, he's a sort of closest to a continuity candidate, the closest to a sort of anointed successor to Sturgeon. What does the landscape look like if he wins? It's not simply business as usual, is it?
No, it's not. It's not business as usual in the sense that Yousaf has promised to address some of the problems in Sturgeon's distinctive leadership style. And again, she was a very technocratic leader. She has a small inner circle, and she tends not to trust people outside of that inner circle. Yousaf has said he will open up the governing process a bit inside the SNP, and he'll re-engage the membership a bit. But on the core questions of internal party culture and orientation, which is what I think this leadership contest draws into question, Yousaf would be business as usual. I mean, he would frame the SNP as a social democratic urban party with its roots in Central Belt Scotland, and he would argue that he wanted to continue on Sturgeon's sort of, this is what he uses the word progressive obsessively. He will carry the sort of progressive flame of Sturgeonism forward. I think there's a decent debate to be had about how progressive Sturgeon was really as First Minister. Rhetorically, at least, the SNP nominally, provisionally, is a centre-left, socially liberal party. So the general thrust of SNP strategy and of the party's strategy for securing independence under Yousaf would go on as usual. Under Forbes, it could change quite dramatically. But in some respects, there's a difference of political language and emphasis. Because I'm not sure really that Forbes' economic platform, if implemented, would signal a dramatic break from Nicola Sturgeon's economic platform. They're both sort of broadly Blairite or centrist politicians in that respect. Forbes might emphasise a bit more deregulation and a bit more pro-business wealth creation, but she's also spoken at length, or at least likes to refer to in her campaign rhetoric, the idea of eradicating child poverty in Scotland. And striking that balance between the sort of pro-business rhetoric and the redistributive rhetoric has been something that Sam and Sturgeon and whoever Sturgeon's successor, it's something they've all sought to do or will seek to do.
And we talked earlier about the Westminster government having blocked the path to a second referendum that Sturgeon was pursuing, and Sturgeon having failed to take enough people with her in regarding the next general election as a de facto referendum. So what options are available to the new leader in terms of sort of unblocking that what seems to be a very clear blockage to those two paths, or either of those paths?
This has been the really striking thing about the leadership contest so far. None of the candidates, Forbes, Yousaf, Regan, has any credible strategy for securing independence. So Regan has said that every election will effectively function as a referendum on independence. Her position is basically in support of the de facto referendum strategy that Sturgeon set out and has since abandoned at the end of last year. And she's used this bizarre, meaningless phrase, voter empowerment mechanism. It just doesn't amount to anything really. It's a phrase she sort of picked out of thin air, I think. Whereas Yousaf and Forbes are more gradualist in that sense. And they're arguing, I think, rightly, the SNP needs to build support for independence up to the 55-60% mark. And then they will take that democratic pressure down to Westminster, and Westminster will fold. The problem is that Nicola Sturgeon has been saying Westminster will fold every year and every election since 2016, and Westminster hasn't folded. So if they were being brutally honest with the electorate and with SNP members, I think each of the candidates would acknowledge that they don't know how to secure independence, and independence is not likely to happen for Scotland in the immediate future. But obviously, they have to play to the nationalist gallery and find a way of reviving this lost momentum.
But do you think one result of Sturgeon going is that the prospect of independence has been pushed a bit further into the future? I mean, I know that's comparing two hypotheticals, and there's so many things that could be sort of factored into that. So it's almost an impossible question. But is your gut feeling that it's less likely than it was, say, a year ago under Sturgeon, who seemed to be preparing to lead the party into the next general election?
I think the major problem with each of the three candidates running to replace Nicola Sturgeon is that none of them are Nicola Sturgeon. And that Sturgeon had set a very high bar in terms of her appeal to the public, her huge communicative gifts, again, conveying that sense of authority and competence. And I think the people running to replace her, none of them can really match her political stature. The question is, to what extent is support for the Scottish National Party and support for independence dependent on Nicola Sturgeon? And I think it is maybe to some extent. I mean, I think she's been abnormally effective and popular over the course of her 8-year tenure. But I also think that the breakup of Britain is being driven by secular trends that will continue long after Sturgeon has left the Scottish political scene. That isn't going to change if Humza Yousaf or Kate Forbes is elected. I think the complexion and the culture of Scottish nationalism might change depending on the outcome of the leadership election. But I mean, I don't think the Scotland's underlying discontent with the Union will go away. I think the challenge for Sturgeon's successor will be capitalising on that discontent and amplifying it over the next 5 to 10 years. And again, going back to this sort of the gradualist premise of modern Scottish nationalism, the SNP has to keep winning elections in order for Scottish nationalism to feel as though it has a sense of momentum. And that means that the next leader of the SNP has to look like a credible First Minister and has to persuade Scottish voters that they will govern Scotland's devolved institutions well. And that's something Sturgeon did very well. It's not clear at this stage if any of her three, or really either of her two prospective successors, holds that same appeal or has that same persuasive energy.
So finally, Jamie, do you think it's possible to say what Nicola Sturgeon's political legacy is likely to be?
I think ultimately Nicola Sturgeon's political legacy lies in the fact that she's made support for independence respectable and mainstream in Scottish society. She has occasionally taken support for independence to record heights. So I think 2 polls over the course of the last 4 years have put Scottish backing for secession at about 58%, historically unprecedented. But if that support was to melt away and support for the SNP was to ebb, both of which could very conceivably happen in the months and years to come under new leadership, less effective, less persuasive leadership, what would be left of Sturgeon's legacy? What kind of impression would she have left on Scottish society? And I think in truth, the answer to that question is not much. She hasn't meaningfully changed the Scottish class system. She hasn't meaningfully redistributed wealth and income and opportunity in Scotland. Her failure on closing the class attainment gap in Scottish schools is emblematic of that. So I think ultimately her legacy is really, domestic political legacy is really pretty threadbare and pretty fleeting. And I do sometimes wonder if Sturgeon is aware of the fact that there was a whole generation of Scots who were radicalised, politicised by the experience of the referendum in 2014, who felt very optimistic and very hopeful about her leadership, who today feel far less hopeful about Scotland's future. And ultimately, I think that's a pretty sad waste of a massive amount of political capital and talent. You know, there was a moment in Sturgeon's tenure as First Minister and as SNP leader when she seemed to have basically an unlimited amount of political capital in the wake of the 2015 UK general election, for instance, when the SNP had sort of swept the boards in Scotland. She could have gone on to do anything. And I suspect that ultimately her legacy will be defined more by what she didn't do than what she did.
I was speaking to Jamie Maxwell about his article in this month's edition of Le Monde Diplomatique, Scotland Prepares for Post-Sturgeon Era. You can read his article at mondediplo.com. If you're a subscriber, you can also read every edition of the paper going back 25 years and online exclusive content. And if you're not yet a subscriber, there's plenty of open access content online to entice you to become one, including the full archive of this podcast. You'll find all previous episodes on Le Monde Diplomatique's website, and you can also subscribe on your favourite podcast app. In the words of John Berger, why read LMD? To make sense of what's happening in the world behind the misinformation. I'll be back again next month with another interview with one of our contributors. So until then, thank you very much for listening, and goodbye.